Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of the Naval Academy's inaugural Ethics Across the Curriculum workshop. I'm Jeff McCrease. I'm the Deputy Director of the Stockdale Center, and it's a great honor to have a distinguished collection of participants and facilitators working this week. I'm going to share our screen here to provide some context to where we are today. So this is day 3, Wednesday, and we might start off by saying that this Ethics Across the Curriculum workshop is a joint effort of the Vice Admiral James B Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership, the Naval Academy Center for Teaching and Learning, the Naval Academy Division of Leadership Education and Development, as well as the Naval Academy's Engineering and Weapons Division. And the workshop is made possible through a generous grant from the Noggle and Ingersoll families. So we are on day 3, Wednesday. We started the week with some introductions and a sharing of goals. We spent the majority of Monday talking about the leadership course sequence, and we talked some about the accreditation and ethics requirements of ABET, the American Chemical Society, and the Middle States Commission on Higher Education. Yesterday, the bulk of the day was spent in a broad overview of moral reasoning and the way that we approach ethics and moral reasoning in the Naval Academy's NE 203 course, Ethics for Naval Leaders, which brings us up to today. We'll yield in just a moment to Dean Catherine Cermak, our Associate Dean for Assessment and Planning, for an in-depth discussion on constructing effective learning outcomes. We've had a slight change. We've invited, after that, Mr. Michael Sears from the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership. We'd originally intended to talk about technology in the classroom, but because I think we've all had so much technology in the classroom over the past couple of months, transitioning to online learning as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're going to spend some time talking about his Radio Stockdale initiative and how he has brought ethics to podcasts and some other online interactive tools. And then finally, we aim to have a few moments left over toward the end of the morning so our individual participants can work in groups on their individual projects. Day 4 will be an independent asynchronous project work, and then day 5 on Friday will be presentations where we'll ask some invited guests to come along. Our goal by Friday is for you all to work on a plan, right? And we'll work on that plan through this template, which is a quad chart that will have a number of different components to it. Project title, an overview and significance of the project you're working on, followed by learning outcomes, a lesson plan, timeline and assessment plan, or next steps. And feel free to adjust this format as desired. And if you prefer not to use a quad chart, well, as long as we've covered the same content, that's okay too. So that's where we're headed today and where today fits in with the larger context. So I'd like to turn it over to Dean Cermak for more discussion from her. So, Catherine, please.
Sure. So good morning to everybody, and thank you, Jeff and Marcus and the team from Luce Hall for inviting me to be a part of this workshop and for facilitating these great conversations that have been going on. And thank you to all the participants for your interest in this topic and for coming back to day 3. Always reminded Boyd Waite used to always thank us for coming back. And so in his honor, thank you for coming back and for keeping your interest and your momentum with this. So we're approaching the midpoint here, and we're starting to shift a bit from the foundational information about ethics and moral behavior that our colleagues from Luce Hall have been sharing with us, how they examine ethics and morals within a character development framework. And now we're going to look a little bit more at the nuts and bolts of designing teaching and learning moments with this content in mind. So I just want to take a moment to look back at where we were, to look at our learning outcomes for the workshop and make sure that we continue to be on track. So Jeff, please jump in wherever you want to clarify or double down on any of the points I'm making. Monday and Tuesday were spent building the foundation so that participants would be aware of key aspects of the leadership character continuum that midshipmen experience across their 47-month program. And so that covers learning outcome 1 and 2. And then learning outcome 5, the workshop as a whole provides collaborative moments between participants and the guest speakers. It was designed to do this, to create new and to strengthen the existing networks across the Naval Academy. All of this really building towards number 4, giving the material to support the content for that. And so today, we're going to build on that foundation and think about how to extend the leadership curriculum within our various disciplines by supporting and integrating ethical and moral reasoning across many different types of learning experiences at the Naval Academy. We want to be intentional in how we do this, making sure that we don't have ethics come across as an add-on, but that it's something that's important, it's something that is woven throughout their education. So to do that, Jeff McCrease asked me to start at the end. And by that, I mean starting with the learning outcomes. These short, concise statements of what we expect our students to know or to be able to do as a result of teaching. And so my agenda for today, the first part of this morning is to start by sharing a few ideas on the value of making our expectations and our reasoning in teaching and in learning clear to our students. And depending on your existing comfort level, spending more or less time on the elements of learning outcomes. And finally, I want to make sure that you have some semi-structured collaborative time to share your outcomes with each other, to perhaps your lesson plans, and to begin refining that work. So let me just pause here for a moment and ask if any of our participants have any questions, or Jeff, if you want to pop in. If there's anything there you want to double down on.
Well, thanks, Dean. I think I might just take this opportunity to reemphasize the importance in everything that we do in teaching, in emphasizing our learning outcomes before we put together a curriculum or a program or a major or a course sequence. That we ought to know up front what it is that we're trying to ask the student to learn or to be able to do, and that set of learning outcomes for that particular class or major, it fits in and complements the larger institutional goals of the Naval Academy as they've been set forth in our mission statement and our strategic plan that we're working on right now, a strategic plan for 2030. So, Catherine, thanks very much for emphasizing that.
Thank you. So the first item on my agenda was, where are we going? And you've seen the workshop outcomes. You have your own goals that prompted you to sign up and participate in this workshop. And we've seen the quad chart that Jeff shared yesterday and then again this morning. And I wanted to just take a moment and think about this particular deliverable and how it could be used to meet both the workshop outcomes and to help you achieve your goals. So when we look at this, engineers are probably quite familiar with this format. And also perhaps those who have done poster presentations at conferences. So this is just a tool to organize and tackle problems. It makes the linkages between ideas more visible, easier to share, easier to see those connections. It's also an assessment tool for the Stockdale Center to see if this workshop is delivering on the learning outcomes that they want the participants to come away with. So up at the top is the overview and significance, which is sort of a very succinct statement of why is this important? Why is it that it is timely and valuable to undertake this activity? And so that's the beginning of this. Then that first quadrant on the upper left is the learning outcomes. And so that's the demonstration of knowledge and ability that you want your students to come away with at the end of this. The upper right, how would the achievement of those outcomes be viewable? What would it look like? So if your students are able to do this, how will you know that they've achieved their expectations? How will you be able to observe that? And how can you differentiate between a student who has met your learning expectations and a student who hasn't? The lower left is the lesson plan, the activities that you will take or actions that your students will take at your direction to support the learning that should be taking place. And then I want to emphasize the lower right for a moment, because you may not be entirely done with your projects by Friday, particularly by Friday morning. So there's a spot there for your next steps, for your remaining challenges, to think about what has to occur to reach your goal, and also to think about what are the resources or who are the resources to help you get there. So the chart as a whole serves as an assessment tool for the Stockdale Center. And I think in particular, those next steps will be useful for the team to consider how well they've prepared the participants, and if there's more that we can do with this workshop to help move participants towards achieving their goals of completing these projects, understanding that projects often take more than a single week to achieve. You probably noticed that the chart begins at the end. It starts with why are we doing this, the significance, looking at what will achievement look like, what will we do to support that achievement, and then sort of circling back to this being a work in progress, like most of our lives, and therefore something that we need to keep moving forward to accomplish, and thinking out what are the steps that are going to be necessary to make that progress. Jeff or Karen, is there anything that you want to add to that, or any questions from the group? And of course, this is a template that should be adjusted to fit the needs of your project and your approach. Okay. So next, I wanted to talk a little bit about transparency. I started today trying to be transparent by reviewing the learning outcomes for the workshop, by sharing my agenda, going over that final deliverable, because I want you to see that the construction of this workshop has been deliberate and building towards enabling instructors to integrate ethics across the curriculum in meaningful ways. And so let me ask you to take maybe just 1 minute to write down your own thoughts, your own practices, what you already do in your teaching, to make your teaching transparent to your students, as well as perhaps why you do it. So maybe let's just take a minute to jot down some ideas, and then we can come back and share those ideas. Maybe take about 10 more seconds. Okay. I can cold call, or perhaps somebody would like to volunteer practice that they do in their classroom or in their courses to make their teaching more visible.
I can start.
Thank you, Deborah.
So I have an exercise called the least worst solution. And I put the students in 4 teams, and it comes at the end of a unit where we've tried to talk about redrawing the map for solutions to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And they've spent 4 weeks talking about issues that are deal breakers, sort of like refugee return, the status of Jerusalem. I'm trying to think about some of the others. Anyway, you get the point. And so they get put into teams. They're given a massive piece of easel paper and a bunch of pens and colors and whatever else they need, and they draw the map, and they have to, with each line they draw, they have to think about who's going to accept it and who's going to object to it. And at the end of the day, they have to come up with some solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict with their map. And then they have to defend these processes of reasoning in front of the group, and then the whole team sort of picks on the least worst solution. And so we end up with a winner. And what it's designed to do is to take them from reading material, understanding what they're reading, being familiar with complexities, and then actually having to do something with that, to take a stand, understanding all of the constraints involved in what they're and I find that at the end of that exercise, they've been transformed in their understanding of something. And my transparency is that I tell them from the very beginning that I am not going to be giving them answers. I'm going to be providing them space to sort of build their toolkit to come up with the least worst solution to complex problems. So that's it.
So you're providing information to them about how this is a learning process, that it's not about you giving them an answer and solving the issue for them, but that you're encouraging their thinking, their learning, they're grappling with it by giving them this space and to work with all the materials and support that you've already provided.
Yes, and the other thing is that we learn through comparison throughout the course. And the thing that's most fascinating is that each team has come up with a different solution. And that kind of communicates the no right answer thing as well. And then kind of like, oh, why didn't I think of that type thing? Or that's never going to work, or, just that whole process of deliberation.
That's awesome. Is there another volunteer in the group?
I was just going to share that with the when we work with classes in the library, we try and incorporate a lot of active learning activities. And one thing that I've done in creating this transparency is at the end of an exercise when we're having a discussion. So for example, if we're talking about peer-reviewed sources, or we've recently used an exercise where it's called process cards, where they get into teams and they have to arrange different types of information sources according to how long the information creation process takes or how much research. They have to come up with these order the different sources, and then we'll have a discussion about why they chose what order they chose, what goes into the publication process, and why it may or may not matter. And so I like to ask, kind of to wrap up that discussion, why do you think we did this? And just hear them making the connection of some of the things they learned and why we did it, why it matters. And so that's kind of a neat way to be transparent with them, but also have them kind of come up themselves with why it matters.
So yeah, you actually take what's implicit, and rather than making it explicit to them, you make it
That's
explicit
right.
to them, so they do the work.
Yep.
That's awesome. Mary, Mark, Wes, I don't see your picture, but you're there somewhere, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm here. I was thinking, my example is pretty simple, but in chemistry we do, especially plebe chemistry, we do a fair amount of demonstrations, and I like to employ ones that will grab their attention. So anything that involves fire or a loud noise. So there's a few that I have in mind. I won't go into the details of them, but it's important, I think, I tell them up front, like, the reason we're doing this is not because it's fun, although it is. The reason we're doing it is because I'm trying to provide you with a visual of what it is we're looking at on paper. And I tell them that up front, not because I want to ruin the fun for them, but I'm hoping that when they do see it, that when I shoot a bottle across the room and it makes a loud noise or something, that it's not that it's just fun to watch, is that we're actually seeing the manifestation of what happens when you heat a gas really quickly. And then hopefully that brings in a physical component to what previously has just really been a theoretical concept.
Sure. You know, it's always a danger when you have classroom activities that are fun, that students can get really wrapped up and engaged with that and not make the connection to the actual learning.
Exactly. So that's my purpose for telling them up front.
Yep.
So I can give a small example of something that works really well for me in Plebe English. We do peer response to each other's writing. So they're in groups, usually of 3 or 4, and they're reading each other's writing. And what I like about how I do it is I change the kind of responses that they do to each other's writing over the course of the semester. So in the first paper, they have to fill out this really burdensome, awful worksheet that makes them evaluate their colleagues' writing in lots of different ways. It's a pain. It takes a long time. The second paper, they have to respond to it. So they write a half page to a page, responding to the argument in some way. The third one, they do very much sentence level, just like marking up the paper. Sometimes we do this like in words comments. So looking at really small errors. And what's interesting, when I tell them about it, you know, they just want to know what to do. What's my assignment? What do I do? And they think it's all about their papers. And so what I tell them is, like, this is also about what kind of reader you are and what kind of advice you most need as a writer and what kind of advice you're best equipped to give as a reader. And the example I give is like when I'm writing something, I often run it by my peers, but I would never take something I wrote first to Temple Cone. Because he's the best close reader we have in the department. He will catch every little error that you make. And there's no point in catching the little errors if I'm not sure if I need to cut that page, right?
Sure.
So that I have sort of a sequence that of people I go to. I know that John Beckman is particularly good at this thing. I know that Michelle Allen Emerson is particularly good at this. I know Temple's particularly good at this. And I can then use that. And if they know what they need and what they can give, they'll be better colleagues as they move forward. Because writing is often collaborative, so that's how we work that. There's some other things to the structure too that I like, but that's the basics.
Right, and you're also taking them through an analytical exercise where they're learning about all the different aspects of it. So that
I actually say with the one sort of dirty little secret is that it makes them not complain about the worksheet because I present it as onerous, but I also talk about how what it's doing is forcing us to look at everything and that it's sort of training us for what we'll do, and then we'll be trained. We won't have to do it again, right? So it also sort of gets me off the hook, which is nice.
How about you, Mary?
I do a couple things. My syllabus is very, very detailed. At the end of every class, I present, okay, what are our takeaways? Why is this significant to you as a future naval officer? That's particularly important in the core course, West in the Modern World, because it's a required course. So in all respects, they're a captive audience. Another thing, I'm very explicit about my grading philosophy. And my grading philosophy is based on a political science professor, Deborah, that I had in college, a junior year class. And I handed in a paper, and you talk about bleeding all over it. And he wasn't afraid of my hurting my sensibilities because he wrote across my thesis, please pardon my bull hockey. You get the picture. And the entire paper was a screed telling me how absurd this was and how awful it was. And I'm thinking, great. I get to the last page A-. I totally disagree with everything you've written. However, you presented evidence and you presented it well. And I say to my students, that's the way I'll grade your paper. You can argue anything. So long as you don't have any egregious historical errors, I will give you the benefit of what you have written and how well you have supported it. You have to make an argument that is credible and well crafted.
Right. So you make your criteria clear to them.
Yep.
And so they know what it is that they're leading. This is leading up to. There's no surprises, or if there are surprises, they're good surprises.
Yeah.
And so we've talked about explaining the process of learning to students. That students sometimes learn better when they know about learning and how learning takes place. Making the implicit explicit, or even going one step further and making them make it explicit. Analyzing the work and breaking it down so they can see the different components and parts of it. And so there's one that I will add to that is near to dear to my assessment heart. There's a transparency in learning and teaching. It's called TILT research program that the American Association of Colleges and Universities is part of. And so I started at University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, but it's come to involve dozens of colleges. And I have some resources at the end if you're interested in looking further, including their website. But one of the things that they found was that sharing learning outcomes with students at the beginning of a course, and then particularly if it's reinforced, like Mary was saying, throughout the course, so that they know when those learning outcomes are being supported and when their activities are leading them to gains in those areas, that this has a positive effect on student learning. Students know what is expected of them, and they also have the ability to somewhat gauge their own progress and take some independent responsibility for their own learning. And in particular, this has been found to be helpful for students who come from underrepresented backgrounds. So in the particular study, it was transfer students, first-generation college students, and non-white students. So I've been in some of Karen's Center for Teaching and Learning book clubs on equity, diversity, and inclusivity. And we talk about what can we do in our classes. And some classes are perhaps easier than others, but it's a challenge for everyone. And so I look at this as, here's a practice that exists, it's evidence-based, it's really easy to implement, and it has these positive results for all of our students, but in particular for students that may not have had the same sort of background and support in learning about learning when they were in high school. So often we find that students who are having trouble, it's not necessarily that they have trouble with the content, they have trouble knowing how to study, they have trouble knowing what to study and organizing materials. And this is a way to help make that clearer for them. Karen, this is really more your area of expertise. I like to say assessment should always follow teaching and learning. But is there anything that you would like to add?
Well, just two things. One is that when I did a survey of the tutors in the Learning Center, the Midshipmen Group study leaders, I polled 140 of them on things that were effective in their experience as learners, things that got in their way, and suggestions that they had for the faculty at large. It's fascinating. We actually have a bookmark that's got the top 10 on it.
Right.
Among the top 10 things that they identified as most effective in helping them learn is clear learning objectives. So even the students know what we know, which is that understanding what they're supposed to be learning is key to helping them focus on their learning. So,
and they're able to use the vocabulary. They are cognizant of exactly what's going on there.
That's exactly right. And I think because they've seen such good examples in so many classes, they recognize when that's absent, which is really nice. That's one of the things that I see a lot in the FACT is students are becoming very attentive to pedagogical issues that are effective in their classes and can figure out how that might be applied in other classes. It's really encouraging to see how sophisticated our students are becoming in thinking about the way that they learn.
And pushing us to become better at these things as well.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff, did you have something or? Nope, okay. So transparency, and then I want to go back to learning outcomes. And just kind of why do we have learning outcomes? Should we have learning outcomes, I suppose, is still a question that sometimes comes up. And yesterday, Roger talked about using maps to reach a destination when there are multiple potential paths to get there. And to extend that analogy here, learning outcomes are the destination. It's where we want students to end up at with a set of skills or knowledge that they can apply. And knowing the destination that we have in mind can help us make smart choices about how we're going to structure our courses and get our students to that destination. So starting with the outcomes, we can organize a course around unifying structure or themes. We can organize our lesson plans around the most important or essential learning that we want students to practice and to come away with. As I already mentioned, students will be able, if we share it with them, anticipate what it is that they are expected to gain from this educational experience. And it helps them track their progress so that they have a sense of where they stand and they can take some independent responsibility for their own learning. For faculty, developing outcomes can be used to make sure that we scaffold our teaching and our learning experiences so that they build intentionally on top of one another towards that desired outcome. And then lastly, what I have, and maybe you have other reasons or ways that you use outcomes, it helps us prioritize when we have to make decisions. So we've had to move from teaching face-to-face to teaching online, teaching our terms in a compressed schedule. So we're not necessarily losing hours, but we are pressing them up against each other. So there's less time in between class periods and in the different moments in our classes. And so this can necessitate some painful decisions about what we need to keep and what's nice to have. And I think going back to our learning outcomes can help us make those decisions. And it's not only during a pandemic. Courses naturally grow and accrue material over time. So working backwards from the outcomes can help to establish priorities. Let me just ask, how familiar is this group with learning outcomes and with using learning outcomes in your courses? So Maria, pretty familiar?
Yeah, I was gonna say, if you can't read the chat, yes.
Yeah, I have to switch back and forth between screens.
Okay, yeah, I can't tell what you're looking at. Yeah, so yes, I'm getting lots of indications that people are very familiar.
Okay. And yeah, Mark and Jeff, you both served as chair of the Faculty Senate Assessment Committee, so I know you have familiarity. So I'm just gonna briefly go over sort of the essential elements of a learning outcome. They're concise statements. The first thing is that they're student-centered. And by this, I mean, instructors generally, they know what they want to teach. They have a plan to cover specific material or content on any given day of class. But learning outcomes are written from the perspective of what the student will ultimately be responsible for learning. And so the first element on any learning outcome is that a student will do something, or sometimes it's written that they should be able to do something. But it's a statement from the perspective of what the student is going to achieve. The next element is that learning outcomes are observable or measurable. They are things that students will be expected to demonstrate. And so there's a verb, and that verb should be something that you can see. So maybe something that students can define, they can identify, they could debate or support. Things that you can see and compare to standards or criteria. And one, just sort of a note of caution is that understand is often the first choice for the verb. And it's discouraged within assessment circles because understand, as well as verbs like appreciate, be aware of, familiarize yourself with, are difficult to observe and to measure either qualitatively or quantitatively. So to sort of avoid falling into the understand, appreciate trap, we encourage thinking through what it looks like when a student does these things, in particular comparing it, that student to other students who have not reached that same level of ability and who can't do those things yet. So the second element is observable and measurable. And then it needs to be clear. While respecting the vocabulary and the terms of art within a profession, the learning that's stated should use language that an undergraduate can comprehend, that they can identify the different areas, that they can define the words, that they know what they mean. And this might take some explaining at the beginning. They may not be entirely clear to students on the first day of class if it speaks about certain types of learning that are expected to occur within that class. So, but by the end, certainly they should be clear, and as clear as possible all the way through. So any questions about those first three elements?
Hey, Catherine, I just wanted to mention how much I appreciate your last comment that the students may not necessarily understand the learning outcome at the beginning of the course. And that's one of the reasons why we really try, when we move from section to section within a course, to reinforce what they did learn and then what they will be learning next and what the connection is between the two.
Right.
Because that in and of itself seems to be really important, especially for these undergrads who are pursuing their discipline and they're not even aware of what that discipline is. So thank you for making that so very clear. I appreciate that.
Right. It's usually a rule of thumb is that a learning outcome should be understood by an outsider. But I think particularly as you take this down to the course level and the learning unit level, that's not something that we can realistically expect, that we are bringing them into a profession. There are terms of art within the profession that to an outsider is jargon, but to an insider, it's a crucial piece of vocabulary. And part of what they're learning is that vocabulary. So we'll make it as clear as we can, but we may have to go back and explain to students the learning that's going to take place so that they can achieve this. So that actually brings me to the next outcome, or the next element, and it's not necessarily visible within the statement, but that's that the outcome can be achieved. So not just that it's set at a level that a human being can achieve, but that we've supported it within the curriculum and given students opportunities to learn about and possibly to practice the learning that we're expecting them to demonstrate. And then lastly, is that this should be something that's valuable, important and meaningful to you as an instructor, perhaps to your department as a whole, or in terms of your profession and what it values. And so this seems perhaps obvious. We shouldn't do things that aren't important, but learning outcomes could end up being sort of a reductionist exercise in terms of making something so observable that you actually bring it down to a level that you may not, that may not be what you really want students to achieve. It's just one step in it, or it's just one thing that's easy to measure. And so keeping them at a level where they're both observable, measurable, but important enough that we want students to aspire to be able to do this. And so at the bottom of the screen, I have a template sort of for how to write a learning outcome. As a result of an educational activity, that part is sometimes optional because it can be really obvious and not needed to state that. what the students, so keeping it student-centered, will be able to observe or measure, and so that's the verb, and then the learning statement, which goes to the content and the heart of what it is that's being taught. And I chose an example here from the Ethics Across the Curriculum workshop, that at the conclusion of this workshop, participants, keeping it participant-centered, will be able to construct effective learning outcomes related to the ethical content in a course or discipline. So this is an example of a pretty good one. Yesterday, Karen mentioned Bloom's taxonomy. And so when thinking about the different verbs that get used to describe what it is that we want to observe our students to be able to do and to achieve at the end, it's sometimes helpful not just to say don't use understand or don't use be aware of, but to actually look at these within a system. And this helps us to not be reductionist in what we aim for as well. And so here we have Bloom's taxonomy. Actually, there are three there are three domains that Harold Bloom worked in back in 1956 when he originally created these: the cognitive domain, which is the one that we usually look to, affective domain, and psychomotor. Higher ed, we typically are looking at the cognitive domain. They're not necessarily exclusive to that. Then back in around 2000, students of Harold Bloom revised his learning outcomes, taking them sort of from what it is or what learning is expected to how learning is expected. So at the top we have, in the original language, the students will have knowledge or have comprehension. And then in the revised way of thinking about this, students are able to remember and students can understand. So right away we fall into the understand trap, but we have within that, what does understand mean? How would you be able to see understanding? And so, we can restate, we can describe, we can discuss or translate or interpret. So taking it to this next level. And so these first two areas are often thought of as factual. This is about students knowing and being able to recall or remember facts or procedures. The next two are application and analysis. And so this starts getting into where students can do something with the knowledge that they have. They're able to take this through, sort of like the roadmap to looking at moral dilemmas. They have a procedure that they can implement, and they can use it to take things apart and understand the different parts of the whole. And then the last two areas are synthesis and evaluation, or in the revised version, they flip them and go with evaluating and creating. So there's a little bit debate about, in terms of higher order thinking, where the stairs on this particular taxonomy take us. But the idea of it being that students can make judgments, and then that they can use this to create novel ideas, that they can put that information together in a different way. And this is typically the area that we think of when we think of problem solving. And so this is Bloom's taxonomy, and I think it's helpful for looking at your learning outcomes and where do you want your students to end up, that they need to do the foundational factual things, but is that where you want them to be at the end of your course, that they can recall things? Or do you want them to have skills that they've been able to use on top of that, to use their factual knowledge and apply it to their learning, to analyze case studies, to make judgments about the correct course of action and be able to defend and support that, or to come up with new ideas. So this is Bloom's taxonomy. Is there anything that you wanted to add on that, Karen?
Yeah, one thing that I have found people find one thing about Bloom's taxonomy that can be incredibly useful is thinking about assignments you've already created and where they fall in the taxonomy, and then asking yourself whether that's the appropriate place for them to fall. And my favorite example of this is someone who came to me because they were just incredibly frustrated because the first assignment they gave their students was an annotated bibliography, and they just tanked. They just couldn't do it, you know, and what was wrong with them that they just, you know, were unable to do, you know, what seems to us like a very simple task, right? I mean, that is in fact the first thing that we do when we're starting a research paper. So we looked at Bloom taxonomy, you know, and asked ourselves, you know, where does this fall, you know? And of course it's, you know, analysis, right? That's not where you start. That's what you work up to. So thinking about how to then scaffold that assignment so that you begin with, you know, being able to define the terms, you know, things like that. And then working your way up to, you know, an analysis of the literature of the field, which is an incredibly sophisticated thing to ask students to do. And it became immediately clear why this was not something, you know, they were able to do within the first week or so of class. So
Right.
it can be useful backwards as well as forwards.
Right. If something doesn't go the way you expected it to.
Catherine, if I might jump in here, I appreciate your letting people know that there are several different versions of Bloom, some perceived to be more modern than others. When I'm working with faculty members, and usually it's recalcitrant and
I don't know where you find those. I never have that issue.
There are a few out there still. They tend to be hiding out in the humanities and social sciences, maybe more than in the sciences, where assessment is embedded within ABET and some of the other traditions. But nonetheless, I have not found the circular model to be most effective. I have found a simpler and perhaps a more archaic version of Bloom that has a series of 6 different columns that are stepped up from left to right, starting off in the bottom left with, you know, recite or, you know, the basic functions up to the upper right, which is synthesize and, you know, compare some of the larger ones. And the reason why I prefer that presentation is that it suggests to them that there is a progression, and maybe I'm just too linear a thinker, I don't know, but there is a progression from, you know, much more simplistic modes of learning to much more advanced modes, and that the process of constructing a good learning outcome really starts with you, the teacher, asking yourself, how far along Bloom do I think the student is capable of going? Is it all the way? Is it halfway? Is it at the very left side of the column, very basic? And to me, that more simplistic representation has become more effective in getting that idea across.
We actually have one of those on the assessment website, and different people like to look at it in different formats. The idea showing that there is a progression, be it a cycle like this that is sort of circular, or if it's stairs or a pyramid. The problem that I find with the pyramid is that there's that people tend to look at the last column or the highest point and think that that's where they need to be at.
Right.
And so what I do like about the circle is it shows that these items are related to each other. But I think regardless, it's thinking through it and talking through it that's important. I will say that the columns would have been a lot easier to get onto a slide.
And it's true. I think people tend to prefer the versions of the model that correspond with the scaffolding of learning objectives. The reason that I resist that is because it suggests that there's kind of a hierarchy to learning, that one is more important than the other. And I don't think that's true. I think, if you don't have, the part at the center or at the base, it's going to topple over. So, so that's why I, prefer the circles as a way of thinking about knowledge that grows out and can grow as far as it needs to. I mean, in some classes, you're just going to stay in the center or at the base. And I don't want people to think that that's some sort of failure because we haven't reached the top. I just think that, that's sort of in my nature to not like those kinds of hierarchical structures, I think. And to answer Maria's question about whether there's the circles could be a spiral, and I think that's, that would be awesome, right? Because every time you learn, a new part of the subject, you have to go back and, start with, really basic vocabulary, right? Even if that vocabulary is, something complex like, the mirror stage, right? You still have to learn what that is before you can start working with it. But Maria is asking if there's a minimum maximum number of learning objectives for a course or a class period. For a class period, I tend to go with 1, or 2 maybe. For a course, I try to limit myself to no more than 8. So 6 to 8, but there's no rule about this. And I will say also, getting back to the question of transparency, I present my students not with I form my learning objectives in as promises. If you do the things I ask you to do in this course, then I promise you will know this and be able to do this, right? You will be able to read poetry closely. You will be able to understand poetic terms, and define them, use them appropriately, things like that. But then I ask them what they want to get out of the class, and we play this little game that that leaves us with 2 or 3 of the the ones that they most agree are central to their desires for the course, and we incorporate those into learning objectives. So having them design some of their own learning outcomes, I think really helps the transparency. And even though it adds, maybe more outcomes than I would like, it also sometimes requires that I revise the course because they sometimes want things that it never occurred to me in a million years they would want. I had one class once that wanted to memorize poetry. Who knew? Okay. So we did that. It was so much fun. Part of their final was a poetry slam where they had to recite a poem that they had written and a poem that they had memorized from among the ones that we had read that semester. So that was just outrageously fun. But it never would have occurred to me in a million years to ask them to do that. But that was really important to this group. So, I think, and I will say, if you're going to ask them to do an exercise like that, you've got to be willing to change your course in order to accommodate what they want.
And you're also going to go ahead, John.
I'd like to confirm. I think the correct number of outcomes is somewhere in that range there of 5 to 8, and I might caution folks, if you're feeling really aggressive and you feel this tendency to want to delineate more outcomes and get up into 10 and 12 and more, I advise against it. I really think if you specify an outcome for a course or a major or something, you've got to be able to prove that you're meeting that. And I think there's a pledge that you make to the administration that if you mark an outcome down for a course, that you've got to be able to provide proof. And if for no other reason other than not wanting to put yourself on the hook for trying to provide evidence of learning for 12 or 15 outcomes, do it. But I think if you get into that many outcomes, you probably not. I think you need to go up a higher level here and cluster those within a larger outcome. So to me, my sweet spot is somewhere between 5 and 7 that I aim for.
Yeah, for a class session, I'm usually between 2 and 5. What
I think we have found on the Faculty Senate Assessment Committee, and Mark, if you want, you can jump in and confirm or deny what I'm saying, is that when you start seeing a lot of outcomes, often they can fit under a higher area, and sometimes they're actually kind of getting down to task level.
Mm-hmm.
So you may want students to be able to perform a Boolean search, but really what you want them to do is to be able to locate information. And so thinking about that, and this is one way in which they can show you that they can locate information effectively. But does it need to be its own outcome? Because if you start getting down to that task level, at what point are you just, are students learning, or are you just training them and spoon feeding them along the way without a larger context? Mark?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that like, if you leave the course and start thinking about majors and programs and institutions, that you can actually really see that, right? Like the now dated, but and soon to be replaced, but like the graduate attributes blow out. Each one of them blows out into a next level, and each one of those blows out into a next level, and each one of those blows out into a next level. I think I totally agree with Jeff. And two things he said. One is that I think that when you see a lot of outcomes, it often means that there hasn't been enough thinking about what you're really doing. Sometimes that's a clue that there's not enough agreement about the larger scale outcomes that you're after among the people who teach the course.
Right, that could be that accrual of we're going to do everything.
Yeah, right. Exactly. It's like a way to avoid compromise. But I also think that point about, why would you have 12 if you have to assess 12 things? It's just crazy. Have 3. Assess 3 things.
Assess 3 things really well, and you will probably have accomplished what you wanted to do with those 12 learning outcomes. But you will have made it easier on yourself in terms of all the other requirements that can go into that.
Yeah, in a weird way, what it shows is, like, when you have a lot of them, is that they're the instructors, the department, whatever level you're dealing with, that they are not at the right level of Bloom's taxonomy yet. Right, that they're playing too low.
Often that's what it is. Any questions about the different elements of a learning outcome, or why they're there, or Bloom's taxonomy? Or are we ready to actually practice? Okay.
One thing I was going to say, Catherine, is I've actually created the small groups for people when we're ready to move into small groups. So just let me know.
Okay.
And what I'm going to do now is send you an invitation to your small group, so it'll come in your email and also show up on your calendar. The time is not going to be right. The time doesn't matter, so don't get anxious about that. Okay. And instructors, I will invite you to all of the groups so we can drop in and out. Does that sound right?
Sounds good.
Okay.
I think this first one we can probably do together, but then maybe we want to have some sort of structured time to refine our projects, our learning outcomes. Let's start with analyzing and improving, or some might say that's a problem solving approach. This outcome, this is not a real outcome. This is an aggregate of different sorts of things that I've seen as an example, but I do have a doozy of a real one if you all want to see it. All right, what do you think?
I wonder how you can measure appreciate. It just seemed a little vague to try and measure how someone appreciates.
Well, I would
Same
even,
values.
and I would even go back and say, do you really just want them to appreciate different theoretical approaches?
I give it a 5.
80%. Sure, yeah, it's like, yeah, what does that? How about, is this student centered?
It seems student-centered. It's asking something of the student, just not asking maybe the right things or appropriate level things.
I worry if it's viewing the students as like they're not, it's not student-centered in the ways that what the students are doing. It's student-centered in viewing the students as like in the content of what will happen. If that I'm not sure if that distinction makes sense, right? So it's about kind of what the students will be doing, kind of as opposed to kind of what the students should be able to do.
Right. It could also have been our students will read, our students will listen and hear lectures. So they didn't forget about students.
You know, I wonder if this is occurring to me just now. I've never thought about this before, but I wonder if the very move to put students in the plural begins to take you in that direction.
In the direction of viewing them as
the
means to a pedagogical process, or
it's like thinking about what our class is going to do. It's instead of like what each person will be able to do.
So it doesn't forget that there are students involved, but it doesn't really treat them as individuals who will accomplish certain things. So the verbs we've heard a little bit about already. Should they appreciate, or they should, how do you know if they appreciate something? Is that really where you want to end up? How do you know if they value? How do you know if they understand? So there are, what are some possible ways that you might phrase those where you can actually see them? Or would you remove some of these things saying, you know, that's not really even what I want my students to be able to do?
It could be as simple as like debate ethical dilemmas, consider varied perspectives, apply theoretical approaches.
All right, and so long as what you're doing within the course supports that, and that's where you want them to be, which, you know, if it's your learning outcome, you're going to give that thought. Where do you want them to be at the end? What is really important to you? How about achievable?
Well, you don't know, right? I mean, it depends on, it depends on the context.
It depends on the context, but I will say that particularly with the rephrasing of these, that they'll be able to debate ethical dilemmas, that it appears that they've given a little thought here to how it is that they're going to support this. They're going to do course readings, they're going to do lectures, they're going to use case studies. We don't know if they're doing this well or not. It's a sentence, but it appears that they've given some thought to what kind of background students will need before they go on to be able to practice these other activities.
I suggested, because I don't know if you can see the chat, distinguish as a verb, distinguish varied perspectives. That inherently, I think, means they're understanding it in a way, but also they can distinguish the different perspectives.
Right, they can perhaps identify their own, and also be able to see where others may be different from that. So identify or distinguish other perspectives that differ from their own. So I want to make the best use of your time. How much time do we have left, Jeff?
We've got as much time as you want, Catherine. we've got some extra.
Well, I have to respect some time.
Well, we've got some extra time for coordination amongst the different groups, so we'll take it from there if you need it.
Okay, so let me ask the group: do you want to focus on your learning outcomes, or do you want to focus more on the learning outcomes within the context of the project?
So
I'm just.
So let me. Okay. Let me ask a question. Are you suggesting that this might be a good time for them to work in small groups and then come back and report?
I am suggesting that. I'm just wondering how we want to structure what they're going to do in those small groups. And faculty, you're all students once and you're professional students, and I know that you will turn the small groups into what it is that you want and need them to be. And so I just want to make sure that I set you up with some sort of tools as you go in. So if you think you just want to look at learning outcomes, I would suggest that we stick with the student-centered, observable, measurable, clear, and think about them that way. Or if perhaps you're fairly content with the learning outcomes that you have, I will, if you give me a thumbs up or go ahead, I'll go to the next slide, which is another way of possibly looking at this a little bit broader. So another way to possibly do this would be the sort of structured collaboration where one of you will choose to present in your group. You'll take no more than 5 minutes. And I really suggest that you keep yourself to that time and talk about what it is that your project is aiming to do. What are the learning outcomes, a little bit of background information, why it's important to you, and that the other person or persons, that they listen quietly, that they jot down notes, and they jot down clarifying questions, but they don't ask them yet. And that they also listen to what it is that you want feedback on. And then we turn it around and let the listeners talk for 5 to 10 minutes, ask their questions, while the presenter then is the one who takes the notes. So how about I put those 2 different ideas forward, and as you go into your groups, you can decide what is going to work for you to help you get the most out of the time that we have left. And then I think maybe in about 30 minutes, we can come back and maybe outbrief our progress. Does that sound right, Jeff?
Yeah, Catherine, if I might suggest, why don't we come back at 10 o'clock? That'll give us about 10 minutes to wrap it up, and then we'll try to wrap up about 10 past. Is that okay?
Sounds good.
Okay, good.
Okay, any questions from our participants here? Okay, then I think we're ready for to go into our group. So we should mute on this screen. Karen, any other instructions?
Yes, if you mute in this room, if everybody mutes in this room, and then we can join. And I would also point out that if you unmute in this room, you can hear in the other 2 rooms. So if we need to call you back in or give you any information, anybody can say something in the main room that will get to everybody. Okay. And so I've sent you emails, it's on your calendar, and I've also put in chat the Google Meet addresses. Okay, so we'll be dropping in from time to time, but you can also use the chat to call somebody if you you want some help. And I'll say, my goal here is for you to get a head start on the work that you're going to do tomorrow for your presentations on Friday. So in terms of, ultimate goals for this session, to share your projects, thinking about your learning outcomes, and go ahead and get started on your quad charts or thinking about your quad charts.
Absolutely.
Sound good?
Thank you.
Okay.